a living history production.
I'm Matt McLachlan.
And I'm Pete Smith.
We're battlefield historians who love nothing better than getting out and walking the ground where great battles in history took place.
And now we'd like you to come with us. Every week, BattleWalks will take you to one of the great battlefields of Europe.
As we walk the ground, we'll dig through the pages of history. We'll uncover the secrets of the battlefields, and most importantly, we'll tell the stories of the people who fought and died there.
Welcome to BattleWalks.
Hello and welcome to BattleWalks, where once again we are walking the great battlefields of Europe. Today we're heading back up to the Ypres Salient, a place that we love to go. This is one of our favourite places. We've done a few episodes on this lately because it's just such a fascinating place to explore, and someone who loves getting up there and is hopefully heading up there in real life fairly soon to join some tours up there is my co-host Pete Smith. Pete, welcome back to the show.
Hi Matt, thank you. Nice to be with you. And yes, I can't wait to get back to the Ypres Salient and have a wander round.
Well, exciting news for everyone, for our Australian listeners, is the government has finally done what we've been talking about for a year and a half now, Pete, on this podcast. Opened the borders, so there will be international travel. So I don't want to be flippant about this. I mean it genuinely. This is a wonderful moment. So as of November, people are able to travel overseas. And it means that we're back on with touring. It means next year in 2022, we will have a full season of touring, beginning with Anzac Day and going all through the European summer. We will have a full season of touring. We are back. Matt McLachlan Battlefield Tours is back. So all of our Explorer tours that depart weekly from Paris, escorted by Pete Smith. Our Anzac Day tours, I'm doing a signature tour later in the year. In September, I'll be doing a signature tour, which Pete will be on as well. So you'll get to travel with the whole Pete and Matt show, where we travel to some fairly exclusive sites on the Western Front. That's the only tour I'm going to be escorting personally next year. That's in September. And a whole range of other tours to battlefields all over the world. So go and check our website at battlefields.com.au if you're an Australian, and come and join us on the battlefields. We've been waiting for a long time. We can't wait to get back over there. Pete, one of the sites we'll explore when we're on the battlefields is this one. It's a really important site, easy to overlook. It's near Tynecott Cemetery, and we've done a podcast about Tynecott Cemetery before, so go and check that out. But this is near to Tynecott Cemetery, one of the most popular sites on the Western Front. But people often don't even realise the fighting that took place to actually capture the area that is now the cemetery. And that's what we're going to cover today, isn't it?
It is indeed. I normally chat about it whilst in the cemetery, in Tynecott Cemetery, which is a good place because you're getting the view that the Germans had, and we're going to actually do it the different way. We're going to start actually where the Australians started. So we're going to start down to a place called Docky Farm. I'm going to walk right the way through and finish at Tynecott Cemetery because that is the final objective. It's where the final lines and the final bunkers were captured within the cemetery itself. So it's going to be a really good walk.
When I first went to the Western Front in 2002, I think it was, our good friend Tom Morgan, a wonderful guide who lives in the UK, gave me advice about where I should go and what I should visit. And when we were talking about Tynecott, he said, don't forget that Tynecott is an Australian battlefield in its own right. It's not just a magnificent cemetery, the largest Commonwealth cemetery in the world. He said it's an Australian battlefield in its own right. And that's a really good point. It's something easy to overlook, that the area where you are walking around that is now covered in graves was an Australian battlefield. This was where so many men died, even capturing the ground. Just fascinating, Pete, that these little corners of the Western Front have multiple layers of history associated with them.
Well, I think it's extra fascinating when you're in the cemetery because, of course, all you're thinking about is the cemetery. But I've actually proven it to people. I've bent down and from in front of one of the graves, I've picked up a shrapnel ball that's in the landscape, and it's just there. So it's a cemetery, but it's also a battlefield, and much obviously, or very obviously, a battlefield because it has bunkers within the cemetery. But more of that when we get back up to the cemetery from Docky Farm.
Well, this battle we're talking about is the Battle of Broodseinde Ridge, which was a huge action that took place in 1917, in October 1917. Why don't you give us one of your excellent Pete Smith potted histories? Because it's a big battle. There were a lot of people involved. We can't walk anywhere near the entire battlefield. It would, even if you decided to walk the entire battlefield, it would take you several days to do it because it's such a huge area. We're going to walk one very specific part of the battlefield. So tell us about the battle in general and then about the specific part we're going to walk.
Okay, so I'll do the date first of all, always important. 4th of October in 1917. It's part of what we generally call, or what we should be calling, Third Ypres. but we have a horrible habit of calling it the Battle of Passchendaele, which I'm going to try and explain as we travel why I don't like us calling it the Battle of Passchendaele, because the Battle of Broodseinde, which took place on the 4th of October, the battle we're looking at, is part of Third Ypres, and it comes before the Battle of Passchendaele, which is the final phase of Third Ypres. So this battle is on a 13-kilometre front. So as Matt just said, that means there's going to be a heck of a lot of troops involved on a 13-kilometre front. It's going to be 12 divisions. And you have to remember a division, if you may not know, so you wouldn't remember, but it's about 20,000 men. Of course, that's at full strength, and the divisions at this time are not full strength, and we're only talking about the infantry, so it's far less than that. But just to give you an idea of the men that are going to be involved, the numbers involved. Fighting side by side, we have 1st and 2nd Anzac. Now, this is very unusual to have both of the Anzac groupings, 1st and 2nd Anzac, side by side, and 2nd Anzac includes the New Zealanders, the New Zealand division. So very unusual for us all to be together, and certainly it lifted and it needed lifting because the weather conditions are not good, but it lifted the spirits of the men, knowing that all their mates were beside them, and this was a true Anzac attack going to take place. The objectives, the final objectives, are about 1.5 kilometres away, so 1,500 metres deep, so it's a long, long way. And certainly you get that view from either when you're standing at Docky Farm, which is where we are, and looking towards Tynecott Cemetery, so that's where we're going to be. More about that in a little while. It's going to be very successful, so let's just talk about this straight away. This is going to be, I've seen it described as almost a flawless attack. Now, there are a few flaws in it and a few hiccups, but what they really mean when they're saying that is the planning of it was very, very, very well organised. It's very well planned. The creeping barrages, overwhelming firepower. It's part of what is now known as bite and hold, and it was known then as bite and hold operations. These new operations that don't have massive objectives, just have minimal objectives, but you go and capture the German lines and you hang on to it. You don't take it and then fall back having killed a lot of Germans. These are limited advances using overwhelming firepower, and that's how they're very often described. So that's what this is going to be. And it's slowly us working our way up these ridges that surround Ypres. Everybody knows about the Flanders kind of plains and the flat area, the salient which surrounds the town. Well, there's this ridge, and this battle, Third Ypres, is all about clearing the ridge. And we're trying to break through, as we always are, but it's important that we clear the ridge and at least give Ypres a breather from being almost constantly shelled.
Pete, many years ago, I did a little bit of mathematics just out of interest. I sat down and using the Commonwealth War Graves records, I noted important days in Australian military history from the First World War. And I just did some rough maths to see how many Australians died on those days. Now, it's not a perfect science because, of course, people would have died on certain days because they were wounded earlier on. Sometimes they lingered for weeks or months. So it's not a perfect science. But I wanted to just get an impression of the cost of some of these big battles and these big days in Australian history. So, as I said, not a perfect science, but still an interesting exercise. And the one thing that was revealed to me is that a number of key dates, for example, the 25th of April, 1915, was obviously a costly day, the day of the landing of Gallipoli. Both days of the Battle of Fromelles were very costly. So the 19th and 20th of July, 1916, the opening day of Pozières, very costly. Some of the days during the 100 Days Advance in 1918 were very costly. But the one day where more Australians died than any other day of the war was this day, the 4th of October, 1917. I think from memory it was about 1,200 and something Australians actually died on the 4th of October, 1917. And many more would have died in the days and weeks that followed from their wounds. But I just thought, make of that what you will as an exercise, but I just thought it was fascinating. It shows the scale of the operation and also the costliness of these battles. And it shows that even the victories were very expensive during the First World War, that more Australians died on the 4th of October 1917 than any other single day of the entire war.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, when you do those little things, because sometimes you get surprises and the casualties aren't what you expected, and other times that they are. And very often what it's connected to, as we've just discussing, this is seen as a very successful action. And immediately when you think of success, you think, oh, well, minimal casualties. Well, no, success sometimes means terrible casualties, but it means a success. And this was a really great success in absolutely appalling conditions, because we have to remember this is that cusp of the change. This is what people remember, really, when you think of the Great War and you're thinking of the mud and the shell holes and the rain and just the horror of it. Well, this is it. And straight away, I should say, this is where we lose so many men. Literally, we lose the bodies of so many men in this landscape during this fighting. So many become missing because it's impossible to bury people properly. It's just impossible. You just roll them into a shell hole, take off their identity discs or one of their identity discs, stick a rifle and a helmet on top, and then throw a bit of soil over them and hope that somebody at some stage is going to come back and find them, because it was just impossible to move the dead anywhere from this landscape. So fairly horrific landscape. And yet you have to say, from reading the accounts, certainly the feeling of the men who were about to attack, their tails were up. They knew that this had the potential to be a success because the artillery barrages are correct. But there's going to be a slight issue, and we'll discuss that as we start to walk, and that is that the Germans are going to counterattack. They are counterattacking at exactly the same time on the same day that the Australians are going to launch their attack. So they're going to meet in no man's land. But we'll discuss that as we set off and start walking the battlefield.
We should remember as well that just the perspective of the Germans about what the effect this had on them, because we tend to get very one-sided in our assessments of battles during the war, and we forget that there was an enemy involved as well. And we talk about the 8th of August 1918 as the Black Day of the German army, the Schwarze Tag. That was what it was christened, the day that the Germans lost the war in 1918. But Ludendorff, the German commander, also referred to this as a Black Day. This was the original Black Day for the Germans. And the commander of the 5th Foot Guard Regiment called 4th of October the hardest day yet experienced by the regiment in this war. So a tough day for the Germans, Pete, that again reflects the success of the battle. We're not going to walk the whole battlefield. We're just going to walk a very narrow band of it, which was covered mostly by the 40th Battalion as they headed up towards Tynecott. But it's a good example of what men were experiencing all across the battlefield. And that's the thing to remember as you walk. We're walking in a fairly narrow column towards Tynecott Cemetery. But imagine as you do this walk, looking left and right and seeing just lines of men as far as the eye could see, all of them experiencing the same thing, but at different parts of the battlefield.
Yeah, exactly. So this is actually the attack of the 3rd Division, so we're well within the 3rd Division boundaries. And we're going to really be talking about, as we walk, the 40th Battalion, the only all-Tasmanian battalion. So that's the one that we're going to be looking at, because they were the battalion that actually took our objective on the walk, and also their objective, the Tynecott Cemetery. So that's it's their route, roughly their route, that we're going to be following as we move forward.
Well, let's begin the walk. We've left Ypres, we've driven to the little village of Zonnebeke, and we've driven on a little bit further out into the killing fields of Broodseinde and Passchendaele. And we're going to head to, as you said, to Docky Farm Cemetery. Good place to start, an area actually captured by the New Zealanders a little bit earlier on. And effectively, the road there formed the start line for the 40th Battalion in their advance. So tell us a little bit about Docky Farm and the start point for the attack.
Okay, so Docky Farm, the cemetery, is behind us. We won't discuss the actual cemetery because we're not really going to go in it. It just makes a handy place to park your car, so you can park your car there and leave it there if you wish. And so we're looking in the direction of attack up towards the ridge, and very clearly we can see Tynecott Cemetery. Then if we look a little bit further left, you can see the church of Passchendaele, the final objective of 3rd Ypres. That is also visible from here. And also a water tower that's close to it. If we look even slightly further left, we can see the New Zealand Memorial to the Missing. It's up on something called the Gravenstaffel Ridge, and that's also on our left-hand side, so we can see that as well. What we can't see are the concrete blockhouses that would have scattered all across our attack line. There were concrete blockhouses everywhere. Now, an awful lot of them are still there, and we'll just talk about this now. As we're walking, we'll see perhaps a few, and certainly the better ones we'll see are actually within the confines of the cemetery. So where are the others if they're still there? Well, a lot have been destroyed. They were deliberately destroyed after the war. But others are within the farms. So when we look at the farm buildings and we look at these little farms as we're walking, then very often the blockhouses have been incorporated into the rebuilding of the farms, so we can't see them. But this is not like the Somme, where there are very few blockhouses. This is the Germans fighting from beside, so it's another thing just to talk about. We often think that these blockhouses, the slit in the front, the machine guns firing, well, yes, these actually do have slits in the front, most of them. but very, very limited fire. In other words, they couldn't traverse very easily, and it's normally long-range fire. So the blockhouses up in Tynecott Cemetery, they have apertures for firing, for the Maxim guns can fire out of them, but it's long-range firing. It's not close work. So as soon as your enemy gets close, out you come and you fight outside of the blockhouse. So when we talk about taking and fighting around blockhouses, the machine gunners, the German machine gunners, would be outside of the blockhouses firing their weapons, and when things came too hot for them, then they potentially would go back into the blockhouses again and shelter. But the fighting will take place outside of the blockhouses.
We should remember with these blockhouses too that they had a very intricate network of trench systems around them, because you'd always think, well, if a blockhouse is standing out in the middle of a battlefield, as they are today, completely isolated, how did you get to and from them without being killed? And the answer, of course, is that there was a very intricate system of trenches that also connected them. So the machine gunners would fight from either on top of the blockhouse itself, and often we see steps leading up to the tops of the blockhouses so that they could get up there with little ammunition niches and all sorts of things they would need to fight, or they would fight from the trenches on either side. So just an incredibly strong defensive system, and that's the nature of the fighting here. Absolutely horrific fighting. And we've talked about it many times, the idea that machine gunners would defend and wipe out half of your platoon and then try and put their hands up as you overwhelmed them. And obviously the Australians usually didn't issue much quarter to machine gunners fighting around blockhouses. It was seen as a particularly ghastly type of fighting in this area. Pete, the other thing when we stand on this road and look up with Docky Farm Cemetery to our backs, and we look up towards Tynecott, is talk to us about the word ridge. You've said the word ridge quite a lot. This is a ridge. I mean, I've been to New Guinea, I've been to Guadalcanal, I've been to Switzerland. You know, are we talking a sheer cliff in front of us?
No, and it's one of those things that I'm always having to explain to people, that ridges are in the eye of the beholder, you would have to say, because occasionally, at least this one we can see that it is a ridge. It's a gentle slope, but it is nothing that would cause you any kind of stress. You won't need ropes and ladders to get up here. This is just a gentle walk up a slope, and so it's very deceptive when we talk about ridges. And certainly the Gravenstaffel Ridge starts off so low that at one point of it, I remember I had to get on my hands and knees to realise that there's any kind of lift at all. But when you're on them, looking back down to where you've come from, you realise that the view is ridiculous from what is a very minimal ridge. And certainly you can see all the way to Ypres from Tynecott Cemetery, the objective that we're walking to. So they're not what you expect. These are just minor ridges.
Ridge in this context means slightly flatter ground than all the other ground around you. It's a very flat area. And so, but that's the point. Again, these are the fascinating little stories that we discover, is that a minor little rise of 10 metres gives you huge opportunities to view what your enemy's doing, because the ground is just so flat. I've walked this a lot of times, and I don't think it's a walk where you would even feel like you're going uphill as you walk it. When you start, you can see that the end point is uphill, and when you get to the end, you can see that you're now on higher ground. But it doesn't actually feel like you're walking uphill. Not at all. As you advance up the ridge.
No, it's only when you look behind you, and that's the interesting thing. Look behind you, get the view the Germans had, and you realise then that height is so important in the First World War.
So I always love imagining the scene here. It's a really good spot to picture we think of Australians lying out on white start lines and advancing across no man's land. This to me was always a really good spot to picture that, because you can see Tynecott up ahead, you can see the gently rising ground. And I always just imagine standing alongside the ghosts of the Australians here on each side with a cigarette casually in their mouth, and as they stand up and begin walking forward into the roar of the barrage in the early hours of the 4th of October. It's one of those interesting spots, Pete, where to me you can connect fairly strongly with that imagery of what was going on around you. It's not always easy to, but this strikes me as an area where you can. Well,
it's not changed again. It's one of those battlefields where the only thing that's been rebuilt are the farms that had been turned into blockhouses. So the farms had actually gone by the time the fighting took place here. So it's a very open landscape, nothing here at all, just that shell hole craters half full of water, just that nightmare imagery that we have of the Great War. But what's fascinating is it's not really changed. The shell holes and the craters aren't there any longer, but there are a lot of ditches and drains. In fact, some of the shell holes are there. You can still see the occasional one or two because they use them for duck ponds, so that some of them are still there. But it's not really changed, so there's nothing to impede our view. We're getting the view that the men would have had. I think I'll just try and explain a little bit of what had gone on even before the Germans, before we start advancing towards the Germans. Is the Germans were also, as I said earlier, were going to counterattack. They were due to try and force us back that morning, and so their barrage had started at 5:27. So half an hour before we're due to attack, we attacked at 6 o'clock, and so the men in those the trenches and shell holes, and it is predominantly shell holes because the trenches have been so badly damaged by shell fire and the conditions, that the men lining out in the shell holes were subject to half an hour at the very least of heavy fire. And there is a figure that I found really horrific, that 1 in 7 had become casualties before they even attacked. So for the attack, 1 in 7 men had already been either wounded or killed before they stood up to attack, and then they have to face the Germans in no man's land coming towards them because the Germans are attacking at exactly the same time. So it was a rather wobbly start to what will become a very successful attack, but you can see how the casualties start to mount immediately, even before the actual battle per se, the actual physical moving forward takes place. So what we're going to do, let's get started. So we're going to cross the road. We've got the cemetery behind us, so Docky Farm. We are only guessing that that's how we say it. It could be Docky. We're not sure. I've always said Docky, and Matt and myself had a quick discussion on how we're going to say it. So just to warn you, we could possibly be wrong. So the cemetery...
I've said Doshi Farm for a lot of the time as well.
Yeah.
It's Dochy. So I mean, it's one of those open to interpretation.
It is indeed. That's what I always say. And so we're going to cross the road, turn right a little bit, walk past the farm because the farm has been rebuilt and it's there, and then turn left and head in the direction of advance. And we're going to here we go again. We're going to be going up a street, a little. It's not a street really. It's a little track almost, very small road. Mallestraat. Is that good?
I think you've done well, Pete. Respect. Thank you for taking that on rather than leaving me to do it. No, I think you've done well.
So anyway, that's the road you're looking for. We're going to be walking up that, and that will take us almost directly to Tynecott Cemetery. So we don't need to deviate off it. It winds a little bit, but we're going to be walking up that street.
I think, Pete, it's interesting as we go past these farmhouses. You mentioned how when they were rebuilt, the pillboxes were incorporated in them. It's really come full circle, hasn't it? Because the pillboxes were originally built in the ruins of the farmhouses. So there were originally farms there before the war. As the war went on, the farms got progressively more ruined. When the Germans were looking for strong points, the farms were a sensible place to build them because they had strong networks of cellars. There were ruins of buildings. It was a sensible place to fortify. And then eventually the farm completely disappeared and all that was left was the pillbox. And then after the war, of course, the farmers came back, rebuilt their farms in exactly the same spots, and rebuilt over the top of the pillboxes. So there's a real evolution of the sites, and on all the trench maps and everything, you see all the farms marked very clearly, and the name then became applied to the pillboxes around there as well. But then today, the farms are all back, so we can spot landmarks on this otherwise featureless battlefield by the location of these farms. So these are going to be key points as we walk along, where we'll note what went on. One other thing I want to talk about, Pete, too, is right on this intersection here of Mallestraat and the main road that goes past Docky Farm. This was the area where a bloke called Wally Peeler, I mean, what a great Australian name, Wally Peeler, did some pretty heroic stuff. Talk to us a little bit about Wally Peeler and what he did during this battle.
Well, Wally Peeler's a fascinating character because he was actually a pioneer. He wasn't even part of the 37th Battalion. 37th Battalion is the one that's one of the lead battalions. I should just say here, 4 battalions in a brigade. And here, we would normally expect one of those battalions to be held in reserve. All 4 battalions in this brigade, the 10th Brigade, they will be used during this attack, which shows you that there was, I suppose, they knew that to be successful, they needed to use everybody. And that's one of the big changes, was using an awful lot of men to attack and overrun the Germans and force them back. And then a lot of men in the frontline trenches that they'd captured, so the Germans couldn't easily counterattack. That's part of these new, I suppose, changes to our attacks. So, yes, Wally he's a Lewis gunner. He had been brought in from a pioneer battalion just to give them some extra firepower in case they were attacked by planes. And he finds himself in the front line. And he's one of those guys that just feels that he's got to help. And as they were driven to the ground by the fire from various blockhouses, and the blockhouses here have a Jewish connection. There's no reason. It's just that they're using a name. Israel and Judah are two of the blockhouses in this area. And he effectively jumps up and attacks them single-handedly because he knows the men have been stopped, and he's carrying a Lewis gun. He's firing it from the hip, and he feels that it's his job because he's got the weapon, even though he's supposed to be doing anti-aircraft duties. And off he goes, and quite often with the shout, "Follow me!" So just fantastic. I'm sure you'd like to expand on that a little bit, Matt, because there's some great accounts of his attacks.
Yeah, he's a great character, and I'm actually reading from my book Walking with the Anzacs here, and he was someone I featured prominently because it's just such a good story. But just a couple of things that he did. So there was the Australians originally when he came up, when they sent him up with his Lewis gun. The other thing I noticed, it would have been equipped for anti-aircraft fire, so it would have had the big sight on it and everything. Not particularly practical if you're then going to use it at ground level. But he came up and there was a bunch of Germans in a shell hole sniping at the Australians, just riflemen, and keeping them down, and they couldn't advance. So Wally just ran and jumped into the shell hole and just took on all the Germans. And he ended up killing all of them, 9 of them, in the one shell hole. And then he came out, and on 2 other occasions, as I put in the book, he led near suicidal assaults on German positions. At one point, he was instructed to take his gun forward to suppress a German machine gun that was holding up the advance. Not content with simply suppressing the gun, Peeler rushed the position, killed the gunner, sent the rest of the crew scurrying into a dugout. He lobbed a grenade into the dugout, then opened fire as the Germans ran out and killed another 10. And then single-handedly during the morning, he killed 30 Germans and captured a whole heap of machine guns. Just an extraordinary action. Unsurprisingly, awarded the Victoria Cross. Just a one-man offensive. As you say, these guys, you read about these Victoria Cross winners, and just, they just couldn't help themselves but to take on the Germans single-handedly. Most of this took place in and around the area we are now heading up the Marlstraat towards Tynecott Cemetery. This is where Wally Peeler was everywhere doing everything. So just a great story. And reading about him after the war as well, fascinating story. He served in training units. He survived the war, served in training units between the wars, and then re-enlisted in the Second World War. Amazing considering how old he would have been by then, and served in Java, where he was captured by the Japanese and spent 3 years in captivity as a captive of the Japanese. And then when he came home, survived that as well, came home, but heard that one of his sons had been killed fighting in the Pacific, and one of his sons died accidentally soon after the war ended. So he lost 2 sons during the Second World War. So again, the long tendrils of history just reached through their heroic dad. The 2 young boys obviously would have gone off in the footsteps of their dad and what he'd done in the First World War, and sadly both of them were killed. So just I don't think we can even begin to comprehend the grief that families endured at this time, Pete, between the 2 world wars.
No, it's something I always think about, the number of men that had children either just before the First World War or just after the First World War who become the cannon fodder of the Second World War. It's something that I've always felt a connection to, because my father was born in 1920 as a direct result of my grandfather coming home from the First World War. Luckily, my father didn't fight in the Second World War because he reserved occupation. He was an engineer. But so many of these chaps that came back thinking they just fought the war to end all wars, felt that security in the first few years, and went on to have children who would then have to do it all again. So terrible, really, in many, many ways.
We should remember their names. So Donald was his son killed in Solomon Islands in 1944, and then Alfred died in 1945. Soon after the end of the war, he was accidentally killed. So just, terrible. But a good spot to remember Wally Peeler. So we're going to head on up the road, Pete, and what are we going to come to next?
Well, we're going to again, straight in front of us, we can see the Tynecott Cemetery. It's very white. It stands out. The ground is going to get considerably worse as we approach the cemetery because there's a little beck here. Now, I have to admit, I've forgotten the name of the beck, and I don't suppose you've got it anywhere. It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. But there's a small beck. A beck is a stream, basically. But there's a stream crossing the battlefield in front of us, and the shell fire. Remember, this landscape is utterly destroyed. So anything that is fairly much sea level in most areas. So anything that helped drain the water has been smashed up, and so now we've got a quagmire. And so the battalions here start to slow down, and the two attacking battalions, the 37th and the 43rd battalions, are going to consolidate, and then they're going to be leapfrogged. And this is where the 40th Battalion is going to leapfrog them and carry on that push up towards the cemetery itself, Tynecott Cemetery.
So as we advance up and we see all of these little farmhouses and fortified positions that the Germans were using, each of them tells a story. It's easy just to, anytime you come past a farmhouse here, it's easy to overlook it, but bear in mind that they were all the scenes of pretty heavy fighting, and the system was fairly similar to capture each of them. And so the ones we passed is Israel House, Judah House. There's another one up ahead called Springfield. And just bear in mind what these mean to the men who are fighting here. So dozens of casualties, men killed and wounded all around them, and then eventually just some of the bravest or foolhardy men, you would even say, would sneak behind them, or using grenades, or men with rifle grenades would keep them suppressed. Hopefully you'd have a couple of Lewis gunners nearby, the light machine gun that could be used to keep the heads of the Germans down. And then men would basically just either rush them head on and just somehow miraculously get through the fire, or more commonly they would sneak around behind it. So just by jumping from shell hole to shell hole and edging around, they'd eventually get behind it, throw a few grenades in there, and then just charge. And as we said earlier on, it wasn't a great result for the Germans who were fighting there by the time the Australians arrived. So normally you don't hear about a number of prisoners being captured from these positions. The Australians just reported how many Germans they killed by the time they mopped up each one. But just, Pete, just a ghastly way to fight. I mean, you're a military man. Just how does the thought of just moving from strong point to strong point to strong point, how does that sit with you?
Well, it's very, very difficult, and the men will not want to keep on moving. And so I've read several times that this whole action was helped by individuals, sometimes named, sometimes not, who would leap up, move forward, normally firing either a gun from a machine gun, a light machine gun, the Lewis gun from the hip, or throwing grenades ahead of them as they move forward, and take the next strong point, whether it be a concrete blockhouse or just a strong point within the mud. And then the men would stand up again and start moving forward again until it happened again. They'd go to ground, and it would then be for either somebody else or in some cases the same man if he'd managed to survive the first action. And of course, that's the sad thing. A lot of them didn't survive the action of doing this very brave acts. But it's those individual acts of bravery which will keep the men moving forward. And it's about speed. And you have to remember that this is in a half light, so this attack has started at 6 o'clock. And they will have taken everything. So just to give you an idea, they will have taken everything that they needed to by 9 o'clock. So it's only 3 hours, and that would mean that the majority of this fighting will be done in half light. So that's another thing to think about. This isn't where it's clear, you can see exactly what you're doing. It's been drizzling, the rain has just stopped, the mud is everywhere. So everything would be mud-coloured, effectively. The men are mud-coloured, the enemy's mud-coloured. It's half light, so very difficult to see what's going on. And it's just a case of keeping moving and kill the enemy. Now, that's the big problem. What on earth do you do with prisoners in a situation like that? So it's not anybody being horrific and thinking, I'm just going to kill every German that I see. It's about survival, that you cannot leave anybody alive as you're moving forward because you might lose them behind you. And you have to make sure that you are clearing the landscape as you move forward. You don't want any enemy behind you.
One of the men, as you mentioned, leading these attacks was Captain Frederick Moule, who charged forward. The one of the final blockhouses were coming for, one called Springfield. It was exactly that situation, that they'd gone forward time and time again. They got to this last one. He said, "Okay, come on, lads, one last rush," and he left the shell hole he was in and was hit by fire from the gun and killed instantly. So the sergeant then took over and completed the capture. But you can imagine how. Imagine you were a private who had advanced against a machine gun. You'd seen maybe your best mate had been killed or wounded next to you. Blokes fell all around you, and eventually you'd participated in the advance, however bravely. Maybe you'd done a lot, maybe you'd only done a little, but you'd been part of the group that eventually captured that pillbox. And now you find yourself in a shell hole with another one in front of you. How do you get the courage to get up and do it all again and again and again?
And we don't talk about it much because it's so horrific, but the damage a machine gun can do to a human body, to actually see somebody almost cut in half by a machine gun, and then think, God, if I stand up, that's going to happen to me, and yet have to do it, then having not been in combat but yet been trained to do it, I still don't know how on earth you do it. How on earth you stand up in the open, moving forward, knowing what can actually happen to you. And I suppose you're doing it because you're helping your chums, you're helping your cobbers. This is what you've got to do, because hopefully one of them will help you, and you will help them if you kill Germans. So that's why it's important, kill Germans, because if you don't, then you're not going to survive it.
Shows the value of sergeants, doesn't it? I think it was pretty much the sergeants who were kicking their men out of the holes and encouraging them to come on. And we're going to talk about a very notable sergeant shortly. Just to describe a little bit further, as we come up now, we're effectively in the field facing Tynecott Cemetery, and this was some of the toughest fighting of the entire day because, as we mentioned in our podcast about Tynecott Cemetery, there's several very large pillboxes there. This is a great perspective. As you cross this field, it's a great perspective to look up and see those pillboxes on the skyline. Just imagine Germans scurrying between them and a hail of fire coming down this slope. And I've got a quote here that describes in fairly exquisite detail what it was like to face those pillboxes up on that ridge. On the top of the ridge, the trench system and line of pillboxes along it seemed alive with men and machine guns, and heavy fire was also coming from Bellevue Spur on the front of the New Zealanders. So that's to the left of the Australians. So they're also getting enfilade fire from the left. The only possible way to advance was from shell hole to shell hole by short rushes. To add to our difficulties, there was a thick belt of wire immediately in front of us, which had very few gaps in it. On these gaps, the enemy had trained machine guns, and we dribbled through in ones and twos, but dead and wounded remained in each gap. Casualties were very heavy. So again, Pete, it's something we didn't mention, but between the pillboxes, the Germans had strung barbed wire and deliberately left gaps in the barbed wire that they then trained their machine guns on. Just horrendous fighting.
Yeah, it's a very clever ploy. We all did that, and quite often, I think one of the more horrific things, certainly from the Somme fighting, was that we'd very often go out in patrols and cut gaps through the wire, so that the enemy wire, so that when the attack came, there would hopefully be some gaps there. And very often the Germans would tape them with white tape to show us exactly where they were. And what that meant was, if they knew where the gaps were, they'd got a gun covering the gap. So it was a kind of come on, right? Okay, go for these gaps. We know where they are. So yeah. A war of nerves taking place as well. Here, there's not that luxury. It's such a quagmire, and so you can imagine these guys preparing for that final rush. They're in the boggiest part, because this is where I looked up the stream. It's called the Newey. That almost certainly is not how you pronounce it. A beak is like a beck. It just a smaller stream. So that's what they've been in that low ground where the stream is. They've now facing a bit of raggedy barbed wire as well. They've got these concrete blockhouses that they can see, and in some cases they can't see. And they've got to do that final rush. And as Matt said, one of the people we're going to look at is a chap called Sergeant Lewis Mcgee. Now, we have mentioned him before because sadly he will lose his life later on in the fighting, and he's buried in Tynecott Cemetery. So on one of our previous podcasts on the cemetery, we talked about him. But what's interesting is the blockhouse he took, called Hamburg, is on our left-hand side, if we're looking straight at the cemetery, and it's still there within the farm complex. And I've several times tried to go and have a look at it because I know it's there, but he's got the grumpiest farmer in the world actually owns the farm there, and he shoos you out, and he looks somewhat mad, so I'm always slightly concerned. I don't want to argue with him, but I'd love to go and have a look at the blockhouse that Mcgee is going to actually take.
I'm the same, Pete. I've never managed to get in there. That'll be our challenge when we reunite on the battlefields, to go and convince the farmer with a bottle of brandy or something to let us in. But I'm the same. So we talked about Lewis Mcgee in our podcast about Tynecott Cemetery, but this is great because we've now got a perspective of the attack. So he was in this field. He charged to the left and captured the pillbox in Hamburg Farm, saved the day, and went on, and he was sadly killed a few days later during the Battle of Passchendaele, advancing beside Tynecott Cemetery, and he's now buried in Tynecott Cemetery. And I also told the story how when I was in Tasmania, Pete, I've only been to Tasmania a couple of times with my beautiful fiancée Jess, and I was in the town of Ross, I think it is, which is a gorgeous town, and the whole time I'd been in Tasmania, I knew that Lewis Mcgee had come from Tasmania somewhere and had earned the VC, and when I was in the town of Ross, there was a memorial tomb in the middle of town. That's where he'd enlisted from. And I literally stumbled across it right in the middle of this beautiful little town. So again, just another, sergeants. We know that sergeants run the army. And just these countless tales of sergeants doing incredible things, and Lewis Mcgee, another great example. But again, that farm, you would walk past it a dozen times as you went to and from Tynecott Cemetery and never notice But it's such an important part of the entire story. And this is a field as well, particularly when you walk the field the way we're doing it. I mean, when you walk up the road through this field, again, you just get this incredible perspective. And you can just stand there and maybe scrunch up your eyes a little bit and imagine the scene in front of you of shell holes and barbed wire. And you can picture it. You can picture the bullets scything down across that ground. And of course, the bullets are coming pretty much at ground level. They're not. If you were standing up, you wouldn't have lasted 10 seconds here. But this is another great place where you can start to get a little bit of an impression of what it was like. And I say to people whenever we go to Tynecott, that field is just so heavily sown with Australian dead. It's just remarkable. Again, a nondescript field, but an iconic site on the battlefields.
I just realised I've never mentioned, I don't think, this weapon in any of the podcasts, and I was just thinking about it as these guys are about to stand up and advance. How on earth do you advance? Well, they've got hand grenades, they've got their Lewis guns, and they've got their rifles, but some things we don't very often talk about is they've got rifle grenades. And these are grenades that you fire from your rifle, so they've got a further reach than the old hand-thrown grenades. And so a lot of the men here were carrying rifle grenades, so it meant that they could shower the German positions before they did that final charge with rifle grenades. And I don't think I've mentioned rifle grenades at all. In fact, I can feel a podcast coming on rifle grenades.
I think we have touched on them as part of the whole discussion of pillbox attacking, but we've never really dug very deep on them.
No.
Quite a fascinating weapon. You're right. All sides had them. You find bits and pieces of them in museums. And tell us a little bit more about the rifle grenade, Pete.
Well, there were basically two types that the British were using, and I know that I have colleagues who will know exactly the numbering of these, and I have no idea off the top of my head. And I wish I hadn't mentioned the subject now. But one of them is on a rod, and the rod goes down the barrel effectively, and then you fire a blank cartridge, and at the end of the rod is a explosive warhead which is detonated on impact, and so that can be fired that way. So it's a rod that comes out the barrel. The other one is called a cup discharger, and that clips onto the end of your rifle, and then a Mills bomb goes into the standard Mills bomb. It's a little different. That goes into the cup discharger. It's also got a little rod on it, but much shorter, and that then is fired. So it's a Mills bomb is fired off the end of your rifle. So there's two types. As to which one they were using at this point, I suspect it was the cup discharger, but I'm sure I'll be proven wrong by somebody. They were very successful, actually, and a very important piece of kit. The thing I've always been concerned about is that firing a weapon where there's a rod down your rifle barrel doesn't do your rifle much good if you're going to use it for actual shooting and aiming at people. So I often wonder, did these guys carry two rifles, one that they just use for discharging their rifle grenades, or did they use their standard service rifle? And I don't honestly know. I suspect they used their standard service rifle, I think.
No, the answer is the rifles for rifle grenades were specifically, it was like carrying a mortar. They were specific rifles that would be used because they required extra reinforcing as well.
Yeah, I've seen banding going around them. Yeah,
that's right. So as I understand it, they were designated specifically as rifle grenade devices and would be carried separately. And the old rifle grenade, I assume it could have been used if he needed to as a rifle, but I don't think they did. But the banding around them. And also the thing is as well, they were not in any way, the recoil of these meant that they were not fired in any way.
No, from the shoulder.
They were fired on the ground like a mortar. So similar to the misnamed Japanese knee mortar of the Second World War. A small mortar that was captured by the Japanese forces known as the knee mortar. Once again, any soldier who was foolish enough to put his knee under the thing when it fired would find himself with a broken leg. So a lot of pressures involved here. But fascinating weapon. And when you go to La Tommy Cafe in Pozières, that's probably the best place to see them in Dominic's recreated trench. He's got a lot of rifle grenades there, particularly the German ones. The German ones with a very long rod. So just a really important part. The combination of rifle grenades and Lewis guns was the formula to overcome a pillbox, and the Australians did it very, very well. We're getting close to the end now, Pete. We're approaching Tynecott Cemetery. When you do this walk, absolutely go and spend some time in Tynecott Cemetery. This is a wonderful way. What I would say to people is if you have extra time and if you're enjoying strolling the battlefields rather than driving from site to site, this is the way you should approach Tynecott Cemetery, because then you come in the front entrance, you have a perspective on why the cemetery is there. The pillboxes at the front now make sense because you've been approaching them towards the field and can get a picture of what it must have been like to come under fire. And then you can visit all the men, many of whom who were killed in this attack, who are now buried in that cemetery. So we won't go into detail because you can look up the the podcast we did on Tynecott Cemetery a couple of months ago and hear all about it. But it's just been a wonderful way to approach the cemetery, Pete, and get a perspective on this really important and often overlooked Battle of Broodseinde Ridge.
It is, and I'll just reiterate something that people sometimes feel quite worried about doing is the cross of sacrifice in the centre of Tynecott Cemetery is designed for you to walk up the steps onto it and sit on just below the cross and look out across the battlefields. Now, some people feel that that's a no-no, you shouldn't do that, but it was designed to do that for the very reason you can sit there and you can look literally at our walk. You can follow where we've walked right the way back to Docky Farm.
We're actually... Some people think it's insensitive and it's being disrespectful to do that, to climb up on the cross of sacrifice. But we are actually honouring the memory of the men, that the people that created the cemetery, the men that died here, because the reason they did this was so you could come up there and you could sit there and you could spend a moment just contemplating across the sea of graves and across the battlefield where these men died. They wanted you to do it. So don't feel in any way squeamish about climbing up on that cross of sacrifice and just sitting there and just contemplating the view in front of you, because it's an important view and a lot of men died and are now buried at your feet in that cemetery. So very well said, Pete. It's an important part of the experience. Mate, it's been a great walk. Thank you. It's one that I really enjoy doing. It's not a well-known walk. It's not one that most people would do. But if next time you find yourself on the battlefields, I would encourage you to take the opportunity to do it, because it's an absolutely extraordinary perspective on a really important battle. And just a wonderful corner of the battlefields. Pete, thank you, like always, for sharing this with us.
No, it's a pleasure, and it's nice to do a successful action. Even though there were heavy casualties, I just must reiterate, this is a successful action, and it's the one before we get the nightmare of Passchendaele. So it's the last of the successes of that Third Ypres, that overall big campaign, Third Ypres.
Well, thank you, Pete, and we'll talk to you again next week.
Yep, look forward to it.